I ran my fingers along the inside of the drawer where I used to keep the envelope. It was empty. I already knew it would be. But something in me needed to feel that emptiness one more time, needed to confirm that it was real, that I hadn't imagined any of it. My revenge, when it finally came, was quiet. It didn't look like anything from the outside. No shouting, no lawyers in a courtroom, just a few phone calls, a folder of documents I'd been building for months, and the particular satisfaction of watching someone realize, slowly, that the ground beneath them had been dissolving for a very long time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Raymond. I'm 64 years old. I taught high school history in Sudbury, Ontario for 31 years, and I retired the spring before all of this happened. My wife, Carol, passed 7 years ago. Breast cancer, caught too late. We had one son together. I won't call him by his name here. I'll just call him my son, because that's what he was to me for 40 years, and I'm still not sure what to call him now. After Carol died, I did what a lot of men my age do when the house gets too quiet. I kept busy. I cleaned out her things slowly, over 2 years, because I wasn't ready to do it all at once. I volunteered at the public library on Tuesday afternoons. I drove down to see my son and his wife in Hamilton every few months, sometimes staying for a long weekend. I watched my grandson, Caleb, grow from a toddler into a little boy who had strong opinions about dinosaurs and didn't like the crust on his sandwiches. I thought I was doing fine. I thought we were all doing fine. My son had married his wife. I'll call her my daughter-in-law. About 8 years ago. She was from a family in Brantford. Pleasant enough at the wedding. Carol had some reservations about her that she only expressed once. Quietly, driving home from one of their early visits, she said, "I don't know. Something about the way she looks at things, like she's always calculating." I told Carol she was being uncharitable. I think about that now more than I'd like to admit. My daughter-in-law had ambitions that outpaced my son's income. He was working as a site supervisor for a mid-sized construction company. Good, steady work. Union benefits. A pension. But she wanted a bigger house, wanted to take Caleb to Florida every winter, wanted the kind of life she'd seen her university friends build with their professional salaries. I knew this because my son told me, not as a complaint exactly, more as an explanation whenever I noticed the stress in his face over dinner. In my second year of retirement, I sold the house in Sudbury. Carol and I had bought it in 1989 for $212,000. It sold for $748,000. After everything, realtor fees, legal costs, the capital gains on the portion above my principal residence, I came away with just over $580,000. I put most of it into GICs in a low-risk balanced fund to my bank in Sudbury. But I kept $60,000 in a high-interest savings account at a separate institution, money I thought of as accessible for travel, for home repairs if I moved again, for whatever came up. I moved into a rented condo in North Bay, small, clean, close to a walking trail I liked. I was happy enough. That fall, my son called me with an idea. He said there was a duplex for sale in Hamilton's East End. The numbers were good, he said. One unit was already tenanted at $1,800 a month, and they'd live in the other. They were tired of renting. Prices were only going up. Did I want to be part of it? I asked him to send me the listing, the inspection report, whatever he had. I looked it over for a week. I called a friend of mine from Sudbury, a retired mortgage broker named Frank, and asked him to look at the numbers. Frank said the cap rate was mediocre but not terrible, and that the neighborhood had been appreciating steadily. I agreed to contribute $60,000, not as a loan, exactly. Or at least, that's what my son said. He called it an investment. He said we'd draw up something simple on paper, that I'd be a silent partner with a claim on a portion of the equity. He said his wife's cousin was a paralegal and would put something together. I sent the money. I sent it as an e-transfer directly to my daughter-in-law because my son said the offer needed to be firm and she was managing the finances. 6 weeks later, I drove to Hamilton for Thanksgiving. The duplex came up over dinner. I asked how things were going with the closing. My son looked at his plate. My daughter-in-law looked at my son. Then she looked at me and said the deal had fallen through. I asked what had happened. She said the seller had received a better offer. She said it was disappointing, but these things happen. She said they were looking at other properties. I asked about the $60,000. She said it had been used as part of the offer deposit and then returned to them when the deal collapsed. She said it was sitting in their account and they'd transfer it back to me as soon as they landed on a new property to consider, because they didn't want the money bouncing back and forth unnecessarily. I said that was fine. I said, take your time. I drove back to North Bay after the long weekend. I wasn't worried yet. Not really. I trusted my son. I had trusted him for 40 years. Over the next 3 months, I asked twice about the money. Both times, my son said they were still looking. Both times, he sounded slightly strained, the way he used to sound as a teenager when he hadn't finished an assignment. I told myself I was imagining things. Then, in February, I drove back to Hamilton because Caleb's kindergarten class was doing a little winter showcase, and I'd promised I'd be there. I got in the evening before. My son was working late. My daughter-in-law ordered pizza. Caleb fell asleep on the couch before 8. While she was putting him to bed, I was sitting at the kitchen table, and I noticed a piece of mail that had slid partway under a stack of flyers. It was from a real estate law firm. The return address had a Hamilton postal code. Something made me look more carefully, not touching it, just reading what was visible. The words, Statement of Adjustments, were visible at the top. I didn't touch the envelope. I didn't say anything that night. But I didn't sleep well either. When I got back to North Bay, I opened my laptop and I searched the Hamilton Property Registry, TERAVEW, which is publicly accessible in Ontario for a fee. I paid the $22. I searched my son's name and my daughter-in-law's name. They had purchased a property on Kenilworth Avenue North in January, a duplex, for $10,000. I sat with that for a long time. Then I looked at the date. They had purchased it 11 days after my daughter-in-law told me, across the Thanksgiving turkey, that the deal had fallen through. There was no deal that had fallen through. There was never a different property. They had taken my $60,000 and used it as part of the down payment on this house, and they had looked me in the face and told me a story about a collapsed offer. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think people sometimes expect the story to go straight to anger. It didn't. What I felt first was something quieter and worse than anger. It was grief, because I understood, sitting in my rented condo in North Bay, that my son had looked at me and chosen the money over the truth, that his wife had sat across from me and lied without blinking, and that I had been, in some fundamental way, easy to deceive, because I loved him, and love makes you want to believe the version of events that doesn't break anything. I cried for about 20 minutes. Then I blew my nose, made a cup of tea, and started thinking. The first thing I did was call Frank. I didn't tell him everything. I told him I'd contributed money to a property purchase, and I was trying to understand what my legal position was. He pointed me toward a real estate lawyer in Sudbury named Patricia Chen, who he'd worked with for years. I called her the following Monday. Patricia was direct. She said, without a written agreement, which of course the paralegal cousin had never actually prepared, my position was weak. I wasn't on the title. I had no registered interest in the property. The e-transfer record showed the money going to my daughter-in-law, not to a lawyer in trust, which muddied the nature of the transaction. She said I could pursue it in small claims court, but at $60,000, I was above the Ontario small claims limit of $35,000, which meant superior court, which meant legal fees that could easily eat up a significant portion of whatever I recovered, and which meant a long, grinding process with an uncertain outcome. I asked her what she would do. She said she'd think carefully about what I actually wanted, whether I wanted the money back, or whether I wanted something else. I said I wanted to understand that question better. She said, sometimes the goal isn't recovery. Sometimes the goal is consequence. Those aren't always the same thing, and the path to each one is different. I sat with that for about 2 weeks, and then I decided what I wanted. I wanted my son to understand what he had done, not through my words. He'd heard my words his entire life, and apparently learned to discount them. I wanted him to understand it the way you understand something cold, through experience, through loss, through the particular education that only comes from watching something you build collapse because of your own choices. I started keeping records. I wrote down every conversation we'd had about the money, with dates and as much verbatim dialogue as I could reconstruct. I printed the TRAVEW record. I printed my bank statement showing the e-transfer. I made a timeline. I also started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored. My daughter-in-law, I discovered, had a small business. She sold handmade jewelry through an Etsy shop and at local craft fairs. She'd mentioned it once in passing. I looked it up. It was more established than I'd realized. She had several hundred sales. She had a business Instagram with over 4,000 followers. But she wasn't reporting it as a business. I knew this because my son had mentioned offhandedly a couple of years before that she just listed it as hobby income on her taxes because the amounts were small, but the amounts weren't small anymore. Based on what I could see from her public Etsy shop, her pricing, her number of reviews, she was likely clearing somewhere between $15,000 and $30,000 a year from this, and none of it was being properly declared. I also knew from a slip in conversation my son had made the previous summer that they were renting out the upper unit of the duplex at $2,200 a month, but hadn't registered with the Hamilton rental registry and that they were collecting the rent in cash. I made a note of both of these things. And then I waited. I kept calling. I kept visiting. I kept being dad. At Easter, I drove down to Hamilton again. I brought chocolate eggs for Caleb. I sat at their kitchen table and ate glazed ham and pretended everything was fine, and my daughter-in-law passed me the scalloped potatoes and asked if I'd thought any more about moving to a bigger city now that I was retired. I said I was very comfortable in North Bay. She smiled. In May, I had a conversation with my son alone. He and I took Caleb to Gage Park one Saturday afternoon while my daughter-in-law was at a craft fair. I waited until Caleb was far enough away on the climbing structure, and then I told my son quietly that I knew about the house on Kenilworth. He went very still. I said I wasn't angry. I said I wanted to understand. What followed was one of the more painful conversations of my life. He told me they'd been desperate. He said the housing market was moving so fast they'd been outbid 3 times. And when this property came up, they panicked and used the money and told themselves they'd pay me back over time. He said his wife had convinced him that I didn't need the money, that I had plenty, that I'd barely notice. He said he knew it was wrong. He said he was sorry. He did not offer to pay me back. I told him I'd think about how I wanted to handle it. I told him to give me some time. He looked relieved. He thought I was going to let it go. I drove back to North Bay that evening, and I made 2 phone calls. The first was to the Canada Revenue Agency's business income tip line. I reported the unreported Etsy income with as much detail as I could provide, the shop name, the approximate sales volume based on public data, the years it had been operating. I noted that it had likely been declared as hobby income rather than business income, despite meeting the CRA's criteria for a business. The second call was to the Rental Housing Enforcement Unit of the City of Hamilton. I reported that a property on Kenilworth Avenue North was operating as a rental unit without registration, and that rent was being collected in cash without proper receipting. I didn't say who I was in either call. I didn't need to. I want to be clear about something. I did not fabricate anything. Everything I reported was true. I did not exaggerate. I simply made sure that the appropriate people knew what was happening, and I left the consequences to the institutions whose job it was to handle these things. What happened next unfolded over about 6 months, and I watched it mostly from a distance. The CRA audit notice arrived at my son's address in July. I know because he called me, panicked, asking if I knew anything about business tax obligations for an Etsy store. I said I was sorry. I wasn't sure. He should call an accountant. He said the notice was for 3 years of back assessment. He said the potential liability, with interest and penalties, was going to be significant. The Hamilton rental registration issue took longer to resolve, but cost them more. They had to retroactively register, pay the licensing fees, bring the unit up to current fire code standards. The inspection found 2 issues that required work. My son called me about this too. He sounded exhausted. The rental income they'd been collecting in cash also became part of the CRA review, once the assessor cross-referenced the rental registration records. That opened an additional line of inquiry. By November, they had drained most of their savings dealing with the back taxes, penalties, and the required renovations to the rental unit. They had also taken on a line of credit to cover it. In December, my son called me and asked if we could talk. He drove up to North Bay alone without my daughter-in-law. He sat at my kitchen table in his winter coat for a moment before taking it off, like he wasn't sure how long he'd be staying. He told me he thought someone had reported them to the CRA. He said he didn't know who. He looked at me carefully when he said it. I held his gaze and said nothing. He looked down at the table. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I need to pay you back. The $60,000. I don't know how or when, but I need to do it." I said I appreciated that. He said he was sorry. He said it was his wife's idea initially, the way they'd used the money, the story about the deal collapsing, but that he'd gone along with it and that was on him, not her. I said I knew. He asked me what I wanted. I said I wanted him to put it in writing, not a formal legal document necessarily, just something on paper that acknowledged the $60,000 as a debt, with a repayment schedule we both agreed on. I said I wanted it witnessed by someone, not a lawyer, just a person we both knew. I suggested Frank. He agreed. 3 weeks later, we signed a simple acknowledgement of debt in Frank's kitchen, with Frank as witness. The repayment schedule was 4 years. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a courtroom. It wasn't the complete vindication that part of me had wanted. But it was real. It was on paper. And my son had sat across from a man he respected, a man who had known his mother and acknowledged out loud what he had done. That mattered. I still see Caleb regularly. My son and I talk on the phone most Sundays the way we used to. My daughter-in-law is polite to me, in the careful way of someone who suspects I know more than I've said, and who isn't certain what I might still do with what I know. She's not wrong to wonder. People ask me sometimes, friends, the few I've told, whether I regret how I handled it, whether I think I was too hard on them, or not hard enough, whether the money was really worth all of it. I tell them the money was never really the point. What I wanted was for my son to understand that the choices you make when you think no one is watching are still choices, that trust, once broken in a particular way, changes the shape of things permanently, not necessarily beyond repair, but changed. Carol used to say that the hardest thing about loving someone is that you can't protect them from becoming who they choose to become. You can only decide, clearly and without bitterness, what you are and are not willing to accept. I think about that a lot. I also think about the envelope that used to sit in my desk drawer. I replaced it now with a different kind of record. A folder, a timeline, a signed piece of paper, less cash, more documentation. 31 years teaching history taught me one thing above all else. The people who believe their choices will be forgotten are almost always wrong. The record has a way of surviving. Mine certainly did. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened between me and my son. More time than I expected, honestly. When you're 64 and retired and living alone in a quiet condo in North Bay, the evenings have a way of stretching out, and your mind goes to the places it needs to go, whether you invite it or not. What I keep coming back to isn't the money. It was never really the money, even when it felt like it was. What I keep coming back to is the moment at that Thanksgiving table when my daughter-in-law looked at me and told me the deal had fallen through. The way her face was completely steady, the way my son kept his eyes on his plate, in a way I nodded and said, "That's fine, take your time." Because I trusted him. And trusting him was something I had done for 40 years without thinking about it. The way you breathe. That trust wasn't stupidity. I want to be clear about that. Trusting the people you love is not a character flaw. What I've come to understand is that trust and vigilance aren't opposites. They can exist together, and probably should. Carol understood that. I think that's what she meant years ago in the car when she said something felt off. She wasn't being unkind. She was being clear-eyed in the way that people who have lived a little longer sometimes are. I wasn't clear-eyed. I wanted everything to be fine, so I interpreted everything as fine. The thing about choices, and I say this as someone who spent 31 years trying to help teenagers understand how history actually works, is that they compound. My son made one choice when he decided to use my money without asking. He made another when he went along with the story about the collapsed deal. Each choice made the next one a little easier to make and a little harder to undo. That's not fate. That's not punishment from some force outside themselves. That's just the straightforward mechanics of how decisions accumulate into consequences. What I did? The phone calls, the tip lines, the waiting. I'm not going to dress it up as something noble. I was angry, even when I told myself I wasn't. But I was also deliberate. I didn't invent anything. I didn't exaggerate. I simply made sure that the truth, which already existed, reached the people whose job it was to act on it. There's a difference between vengeance and accountability, and I tried to stay on the right side of that line. The part that took the most out of me wasn't the investigation or the waiting. It was sitting across from my son in Gage Park that Saturday in May, with Caleb climbing in the distance, and listening to him tell me that his wife had convinced him I wouldn't notice, that I had plenty, that the loss wouldn't register. He wasn't entirely wrong about the money. He was entirely wrong about what it meant to say it out loud. I think about Caleb most of all. He's 6 years old. He doesn't know any of this happened. He still draws me pictures of dinosaurs and presents them very seriously like official documents. I keep them on my fridge. Whatever else fell apart this year, that didn't. What I'd want anyone to take from this is simpler than it might sound. Document everything, trust thoughtfully, and understand that the choices you make when you believe no one is watching are still shaping something. They shaped my son. They shaped this year, and in a quieter way, sitting at my kitchen table in December watching him sign his name next to mine on that piece of paper, they shaped what comes next, too. I don't know yet what that looks like. But for the first time in a long while, I think it's worth finding out.